Welcome to another meeting of the Leadership Lessons series brought to you by the Schulich Executive Education Center, or SEEK. My name is Matthias Kipping. I'm a professor and the Richard E. Ward Chair in Business History at Schulich. And it is with great pleasure that I welcome our guest today, Jean-Paul or JP Gladu, an Indigenous business leader, actually not just any Indigenous business leader. Very few will know Indigenous business better than he does. Since 2012 until very recently, he was the president and CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, CCAB, and his own career has been in natural resources, beginning with forestry. He also holds an EMBA from Queen's and an ICCD designation from Rotman. I will share some more of his story and his many other roles and achievements as we go along. As always, please post your questions on Q&A and I will try to feed them into our conversation. I would like to structure this conversation along three issues: environmental, social, and governance, or ESG. These are becoming increasingly important anywhere and probably matter as much, if not more, to Indigenous communities. But before getting to these, I would like to start by asking JP to tell us a bit more about Indigenous business. At some other occasion, you actually characterized Aboriginal business as the most underreported success story, and that's a quote, in Canada. Can you share some of these successes?
Thanks, Matthias, for the very kind introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I am calling, or at least I'm video linking in here from Calgary, next to Stina First Nation. I'm, as you mentioned, Matthias, Ojibwe Anishinaabe from Northern Ontario, from the Thunder Bay region. Indigenous business, the amazing thing about it is that we're incredibly prolific. I believe the most recent figures that CCAB has approached with their new amazing leader, Tabitha Bull, I think we're starting businesses 9 times that of the average Canadian. There's, I understand, over 50,000 Indigenous businesses competing in pretty much every sector that you can think about. Many are on reserve, many are off reserve. I don't think Canadians understand the breadth and width of our Indigenous entrepreneurs and the actual economic impact that we're having in the Canadian economy. The figures back in 2016 were around $12 billion contributing on a regular basis to the economy. I just got off a flight from Edmonton yesterday. I sit on the chair of on the board of directors for the Mixed Group of companies. That company alone, with its joint ventures and its wholly owned companies, is producing $300 to $400 million a year in revenue. They've got a partnership with Fort McKay First Nation and an East End project with Suncor, where they raised $504 million for that project. It's Indigenous businesses competing in tourism, technology, management consulting, photography, media. It's incredible, and the growth trajectory is quite strong.
Well, thank you. That's, I mean, again, probably not many of the people watching today will have known the kind of extent of Indigenous business and the success. So it's good to know that it's fast growing, it's everywhere. But at the same time, I think a lot of Indigenous business is actually in natural resources, and you started your own career in natural resources, and the Mikisew group of company, I think, is heavily involved in the oil sands in Alberta, if I understand it correctly, the way you're now the chair of the board. So at the same time, and on the other hand, we have still probably fresh in the public's image the protests of the Wet'suwet'en against the construction of a pipeline through their territory. So what does this tell us about the relationship between the Indigenous people and communities and the environment, which was the first issue I wanted to address in some detail? It's clearly not something very simplistic.
It's a very complex story for sure. Matthias, Canadians have this perception that we're opposed to resource development, as you just mentioned. One segment of the Wet'suwet'en, which is the hereditary chiefs, there was a fracture in the approach and acceptance of the gas project. So it's one segment of one First Nation out of 20 that didn't support the project, but there were 20 First Nations that did support that project. We are considered the caretakers of the land. We're not, I volunteer time for the Indigenous Resource Network, and the work of our Indigenous leaders talking about the importance of the natural resource sector for the jobs. Tens of thousands of our people rely on oil, gas, mining, and forestry in the energy sectors for our jobs and for our businesses to support our families and communities. So we're not opposed to development at all. What we are opposed to is irresponsible development. We are opposed to development the way it's been done in the past, where our people are on the peripheral looking in, wondering what's happening. And we're not benefiting from the jobs, we're not benefiting from the business opportunities. There is a major shift in this country. Some of the work that I was doing on the Federal Task Force for Resilient Recovery is that we've got to make sure that Indigenous people and communities are armed with the capital to participate as equity partners in projects. The challenge in our country is that there's such regulatory burden and uncertainty with regards to the Indigenous relationships that foreign capital it's evading. We can't build projects in this country because of things like that. So we've got to do business differently. And that when we come to the natural resource sector, our people have to be engaged in the entire life cycle of a project. So we have a big responsibility, but we have to do it differently.
I mean, again, you yourself, you say also Indigenous people have a very strong relationship to nature, to the land. And again, you hunt regularly, or you renew your connection with the land. I think that plays an important... I
just did that last week. I just came out of the bush last week with my family north of my reserve, and we were very lucky. The Creator blessed us with a couple of moose and netted a lot of fish, and so we're supplying meat now to our community. But there is that strong connection, and the thing is, we don't want to make a mess of our backyards because we've been there for thousands of years, and we're going to be there for thousands of more. But it's that balance between managing poverty and managing wealth, and we're tired of managing poverty. That is no fun. So how do we get into the space where we start generating wealth so we can manage that? That's a lot more enjoyable.
And that brings me actually to my next point, which is the social. The peoples who came to what we call Canada today brought a lot of pain and hurt to the peoples who were already here, starting with all the European diseases. And, we're talking about our pandemic. I mean, if you go back in history, European diseases like smallpox and so on wiped out a large part of the Indigenous population, not only in Canada, but in North America and the Americas in general. And since then we've had more conscious and even systemic suppression of Indigenous people and their opportunities until very recently. In your own family, again, I know that you're open about this. Your own family suffered from this. Two of your grandmothers were sent to residential schools, and your family was forcibly removed from the land. And I'm not sure how we can really right all those wrongs that were done over centuries to the Indigenous people. But it was interesting because when, in your role as the president and CEO of the CCAB, you coined a term, economic reconciliation. So this was all about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they had put that on their list of actions, but it came, at the very end of that long list. Yeah. So, and it wasn't really given the importance probably that you think it should, deserve. So what do you mean with economic reconciliation? How can we go about doing that?
We were Canada's first entrepreneurs. We had trade routes, we had technology that's used today, our medicines, our canoes, all sorts of things originated from our knowledge systems. We helped the newcomers establish a trade that had global implications. And over time, that was eroded through colonialism, through residential schools. As you mentioned, both our grandmothers were taken. A couple of my uncles, 60 scoop. So there was a lot of hurt. And Canadians need to understand, just as a little bit of a side, we're not blaming anybody today, but we've got to bring it up. We've got to have these tough conversations. So no, we can't address the past by going back in history and doing it, but we can look at what the future is going to look like. And so when we think about economic reconciliation, the way that I look at it is kind of the end game, and that's when we start managing wealth. And because I can tell you, chief and councils that have to manage poverty, it's hand to mouth. It's debilitating. It's heartbreaking. Having a community dependent on government resources. So we need to start to think about how we're going to generate wealth. And the business lens and the economy is so crucial, of course, to generate that, leveraging our assets, which are our people, our land, and our innovation through the business lens. So I think there's big hope. There's a lot of communities that are doing exceptionally well. You know, like look at, again, I'm here in Alberta, so I'll use the Fort McKay First Nation community. Their average salary is then close to, I think it's around $75,000 a year.
That's good.
Because of business. You know, I've been in the community a number of times. I've got a lot of friends up there. I was supposed to run the Boucher group, which was 1,000, which was when I was coming to Alberta was 1,050 strong. But of a COVID casualties that didn't quite come to fruition. I bet 43% of their staff are Indigenous. That is success, and that's what we need to be aiming for. It's not just in the oil and gas sector. It's in the forestry. It's in the technology. It's in education. It's across the board. So there's a lot we can be doing.
I just want to bring in a question from Sarah Morris-Lang. She talks about the project reconciliation pipeline. I don't know whether you're familiar with that, where there would be an ownership in the 51% ownership in the pipeline to create a wealth fund, and you know, we'll use that wealth fund to fund projects in the community. Is that something like joint ownership?
That's exactly the type of things we need to be thinking about. And again, being here, sorry to use Alberta, but I hold what the Alberta government has been doing as of late from a provincial perspective in very high regard. Premier Kenney and his government have set aside $1 billion for backstop for Indigenous infrastructure projects. The governance of that body is full of Indigenous people. The newly appointed CEO is a dear friend of mine, Alicia Dubois, just came over from CIBC and heading up their Indigenous banking. She's running the Crown Corp, and they're there to support Indigenous backstop in infrastructure. The amazing thing about when you start thinking and acting differently with regards to that is that it's attracting all sorts of non-Indigenous partners to the table. And we're there as equals now because we've got cash in our pocket, well, at least the backstop from the government, to build these projects together. When you build things together, when you're in the trenches together, you start to formulate relationships. There's nothing like a little bit of stress and like sticking together and getting through to the end. And you come to the end, you go, holy crap, that was a tough experience, but now I trust you. We did it together. And Project Reconciliation is one of those Indigenous firms that are looking to take ownership with communities on that project. And that's exactly what this country needs to be doing.
Has the pandemic made that more difficult? I mean, again, also the collapse in the oil price and you know, the dependence, a lot of these projects on oil prices and on the, you know, has that made it more difficult?
Oh, 100%. It has. Right now, I'm also the president of A2A, Alaska to Alberta Railway, and I can't get into the communities like I would like to. And when you're building relationships, you know, our new reality of Zoom and everything, if you have pre-existing relationships, you know, you can get through these Zoom calls. But unless you've got somebody to link you, it's very difficult because it's, especially in the Indigenous community, you've got to have face-to-face because there's a ton of mistrust, even in the best of days, because we've been well lied to for generations. And it's so the trust, it takes a long time to build that trust in the Indigenous community, and the pandemic is definitely not helping.
And that, you know, also more general, I mean, now we're finally talking more about it, about systemic racism, systemic discrimination. Do you see any light at the end of the tunnel there? I mean, it's become sexy now, I understand that, but have there been, you know, more efforts even before it became sort of more public to deal with that? Because it's there. I mean, we would be amiss of not acknowledging that it's there. And you know this better than anybody else.
Yeah, you know, I think it's getting better. I think it's getting a lot better. So Aaron O'Toole and I chatted when he made his last run, and I helped him with his platform on Indigenous issues. And so to see a conservative coming to the table to talk to Indigenous people, I think that speaks volumes. Conservative Party has not typically been open to these types of relationships, but I think Aaron's doing a great job. The Liberal government, of course, has put our country on a new trajectory. It can be debated on how good that trajectory has been, but Canadians are opening up. Truth and Reconciliation Commission, even the Lake Downie, who challenged Canadians to do better with regards to Canadians are. I was on my flight over in Air Canada the other day, and I was wearing my moose hide patch, and it triggered a conversation with people. People are curious; they want to know. And yeah, just so you know, Matthias, we've always been sexy as Indigenous.
Yeah.
But it's nice that people are asking us
Yeah.
now about what we can be doing together, and it's getting better. You can see it in the numbers and the education that's coming up with our people. You can see it in our business acumen. You can see it in our negotiations. You see it. We're on board of directors of major corporations. I assisted Ontario Power Generation. There's incredible Indigenous leaders all over the place doing that support.
Yeah, that brings me, again, you mentioned the Ontario Power Generation, so that brings me to another issue, the third of our, so we talked about the environmental, the social, now the government's issue is, so again, we know that Indigenous people have to be part of these, diversity and inclusion initiatives very clearly, but you also say, hey, but that not just throughout the organization at employee manager level, but we need Indigenous people on boards. I mean, like you mentioned, not just of Indigenous companies, but of non-Indigenous companies. So you said why do you think that's so important that you have board members that are Indigenous?
I've been quoted saying this a couple of times. I'm going to say it again anyways, because I have fun saying it. When you look at the history of boards, it's typically very pale, male, and stale. And that is not representative of our country. So the diversity of our country needs to be seen, and not just, I always have this debate and with friends and colleagues. You don't do it just for the sake of filling those seats with minorities and Indigenous. You find the right people. But I can tell you, when people say, "Oh, we can't find any Indigenous people to sit on boards," I'm going, "Well, you obviously are not looking, because I can name you 30 to 50 of them right now that are exceptional." And so it sends a signal to the Indigenous community that the company is actually taking these issues really seriously by making sure that somebody that looks like me is on a board helping direct strategy and liability and all the succession planning and all the things that you have to do as a director. So it becomes as a beacon. And I can tell you in my experience with OPG and Noront during fire, I still sit on that
That's
board.
Right, yeah.
The other directors truly appreciate my perspective, and I push their comfort levels, and it's vice versa. Board work is really important. What's really interesting, I just got out of my board meetings in Edmonton yesterday with the Mikisew group, and we have an independent board. We have 3 non-Indigenous people on our board. So that again is progression, because it's that it'd be hypocritical, in my opinion, to sit on a board that's only made up of Indigenous people, because that's not reflective of what the business capacity and the diversity that we need in our board to strengthen us, to have stronger outcomes as a result of that diverse thinking and group thinking and everything else. So it's a two-way street.
And I agree with that. So again, it's this two-way street. And one thing I want to discuss is a little bit, and again, it goes back to something you've said, is what can the non-Indigenous people learn from the Indigenous people in terms of managing? I mean, you said, I quote you, "The world needs more Canada, and Canada needs more Indigenous in the way we approach business." So what are exactly those things that Canada needs? And I agree with you, it needs to be that two-way street. And so what can we learn from?
It's one of my favorite things when I was younger as a practicing forester. I was working for my community in Northern Ontario, and one of the things I loved doing was poring over maps in the forestry sector with elders and learning from them about their connections to the land and the importance of conservation and protection and responsible development. And having that knowledge of thousands of years at the table, it was just absolutely important. And often when we think about Canada, we were blessed with it and have been endowed with a very strong resource economy. And Indigenous people, we've been on the land for a very long time, and our approach to it is different. When we look at our governance, and I can't talk at school too much, but I can say, when we're at the Mikisew board, and I'm a co-founder of my own communities development corporation, Mokwateh, our shareholders are the community members. And those community members are the ones that are on the ground all the time, like myself, hunting and fishing. And that information, that value, that experience comes up. And that relationship from the community to the board translates in a very direct way, because the chief and council are representative of those shareholders. And it's a different thing, it's a different thought process. It's a different way of relating to the land and to the work and governance, and it is different. And I think it's important to, with ESG going on very strong in our world, investors are looking for those responsible companies. And I think having that Indigenous worldview only strengthens that whole realm, that governance realm.
I have a few questions, and I'm going to ask them. I want to invite people to ask more questions. You're here to and don't shy away from controversial questions. I mean,
please throw them at me. So I can tell you that I'm not the COCCAB anymore. I have a little more latitude.
Yeah, but there were two questions actually referred to education. What can education do to help? And are we missing? Somebody says, what about Indigenous computer scientists? Is that something that? And again, anything in education. I mean, if you look at your own career, education played an incredible role. Starting you as a forestry technician, but then you got a lot more education. So how can education help when we're an educational institution?
Inspire is a great organization. I believe they just made an announcement of their new CEO. I think it was Mike Dunyan, what I've heard from one of my colleagues. Education is what's going to transform. Our fearless leader, Senator Sinclair, he's been quoted a number of times saying, it's education that got us into this mess. It's education that's going to get us so. And so schools like yours feel really fundamentally important to the advancement. Like I have my MBA, and I wouldn't be where I am today without that education for sure. Interestingly, though, one of the things that I've challenged schools, all business schools, including Queen's when I was there, and the feedback that I did continue to give to the school is, when you do your case studies, do you read any Indigenous entrepreneurs?
No, I agree. I mean, I talk about the early days. I talk about in my class because it's history, the Hudson's Bay Company and the relationship with the Indigenous peoples then, but.
That's it. So you're not doing your students service when you're sending them to the world with Indigenous issues being such a prominent thing, issues to deal with, to work with. So I think it's a two-way street. I think we need to be educating non-Indigenous business leaders about the Indigenous world as well, and understanding that there's big business. It's just a matter of time before we're in the top 100 publicly traded companies. Look at the Seminoles in Florida. They are a big company, and they own a third of Hard Rock Cafe. So I think education is a two-way street.
Yeah. So and I think we have that initiative now to bring in more Indigenous racialized people into the cases we discuss and so on, and that's great. Very, very. I agree. It's very important, and I admit myself that I could have done more, and I am doing. I will do more. But,
great. Well, that's why we have our relationship too. So
yeah, no, that's great. And I've already said I'll invite you to talk to my EMBA students who need you need the views like yours, and so that's very, very important. You talked about that recovery commission you're in, or what's being discussed there to help Indigenous communities again we're faced with the resource prices going down and so on.
Yeah, I mean. I get challenged because I'm kind of a unicorn, because I get into resource companies and I make them feel uncomfortable with conservation talks and discussions. And I'm the inaugural chair for the Indigenous Boreal Leadership Group, and the Boreal Leadership Campaign around conservation and responsible development. And the whole budget and the conversation that we were talking about was green recovery. And what directly annoys me in this country is that we're becoming more divided than ever. It's always an or, and it should be an and. We could be utilizing this transition, and we're never going to fully transition from oil and gas. It's all the products that we use, the chemicals, the plastics. It's such an integral part of the economy, and it's the most regulated and ethical oil in the world. But yet Canadians are fighting against some Canadians are fighting against our oil and gas sectors, which makes no sense to me. When we can be using the green technology to lower our greenhouse gases, the intensity that's required to extract our oil and gas. I think retrofits of homes using more of the technology in our northern communities is really important. There's a $30 to $40 billion deficit in infrastructure in our northern communities. If we don't have reliable energy, clean water, housing, so anything there to augment our energy in our northern communities is really important. There's also a strong pusher and advocate that the federal government needs $1 billion revolving fund, similar to but it's got to be deeper and longer to support Indigenous infrastructure projects in the recovery of energy products. So it's those types of things that I think that we need to be thinking and acting a little bit differently in our policy. And then one of my proudest moments at CCAB and what we were able to achieve was procurement and getting the government to target 5%. Anytime we talk about procurement, if you get the best widget in the world, the best service, but if you can't get it to market, obviously it's not going to be very good for your business. So having defined targets for Indigenous entrepreneurs in procurement is really important. Right now, the government spends their $16 to $20 billion less than a percentage, which translates to a few $100 million a year. When a company like Suncor spends just as much as the federal government does in any given year, one company.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So
that's simple policy shifts can make a big difference in the lives of Indigenous Canadians or any group that you're trying to target.
So there's an important question from Jane Garthen. She said, "I'm in Toronto, and of course Toronto has a large Indigenous population. So we've been talking so far more about the Indigenous communities in the northern part of the country. But what can is there any programs for these Indigenous communities? What can be done to help the urban Indigenous communities?"
That's a great question. Over half of our population now are in urban centers, and there's an unofficial count of 80,000 plus Indigenous people in the Toronto area. Having lived there for almost 8 years with CCAB role, there's lots of great Indigenous organizations. There are programs like Kajita Meekum, Mizweebik, that are employment type programs. There are programs that also support financially Indigenous entrepreneurs. I'll relate a story to you, and I love telling this story. When I was practicing forestry, learning about forestry when I was young in the tech program for SSU St. Marie, and we were all lined up on a road, and we were looking at this tree, and our teacher was saying, "What do you think that is? A 1, 2, or 3 very high grade to middle grade to low grade pulp?" And we all started yelling out, "Well, it's a 1 or a 2, 1 or a 2." And our instructor said, "You're all wrong." "Well, what do you mean?" Which is not one of you got up to walk around the tree to look on the other side. It could have a big split. It could be a 3. You just don't know. You haven't spent the time investigating. And that's the same thing to Canadians and people that live in the cities. There are lots of cultural activities going on. There are centers that you can volunteer your time with to understand the Indigenous community and support and build those relationships. So if you really want to understand, you got to walk around the Aboriginal tree, and don't be afraid to do it, because we're very receptive. We want those relationships. Is there a lot of hurt and pain? Back to one of your earlier questions with us. Absolutely. Is there still mistrust? Absolutely. But we're only going to break down those barriers until we engage.
Great. That's, and I encourage everybody to actually go out and do that. And I think that's what you're encouraging. So and that's the same is true for business. I think, finding those Indigenous businesses and reaching out to them and involving them in your own project. If you have a small business and link up with another business, I guess.
Yes.
How do we educate ourselves more? And you said one is going out. And the other thing is, I think you suggested some books or some movies to get a better feel for this. So is there anything you can leave us with? We got another minute. And so for those who want to know more, like you said, go out and reach out to the Indigenous community. 80,000 people, they have organizations and events and things. But is there anything else we can do?
There's so many great Indigenous organizations. Go over the 94 calls, at least read the headlines, see what resonates with you. Because you're only going to do something that you're passionate about. And there's education, health, economy, all sorts of things that you can engage in that drive your spirit, drive your heart. Do a cursory environmental scan of what organizations are in your area, and pick up the phone and say, I'm interested in helping. Show up to events. If you've got a budget, sponsor an event. if you're, if you've got Indigenous friends, ask them to, JP, God, this moose, it's, can I come over for dinner? And, it's just like, we're just people like anybody else, and find ways to engage in being genuine about it. And sometimes it's just sponsoring events. So many Indigenous organizations that could use some support.
Okay. JP, thank you so much. I personally learned a lot from just interacting with you. We had a pre-meeting, and I've been starting to read some of the stuff you recommended, and great. And I hope you continue the way you've been as this, a positive force. And thank you for coming here. And as I said, I'll bring you to see my students, and I'll do more in my class to bring these open people's eyes. That's what it's really about. So this.
And if I may, to any of the folks that didn't get their questions answered, please feel free to look me up, drop me a note. I'll try my best to get back to you. I'm always, when I've got time, I'm always willing to help and engage. And
for those, who want to see this conversation again, we've taped it, and, I'm sure many others who weren't able to come today at this time will watch it. And thank you again from all my heart. It's really been great to get to know you and to get to know what you've been already doing. And I'm sure there'll be so many more things that if we talk again in a few years, there are more things to report. And thank you so much. And thanks everybody for being here. And now I hand over to Robert Lynn to talk about our next speaker. Thank you, JP.
Thank you, Matthias. And please feel free to join us at our next fireside chat, Leadership Lessons from a Volunteer-Based Organization. That's on Thursday, October 8th at 1 p.m. with Meena Mawani, President and CEO of Crohn's and Colitis Canada. A special thank you to JP today for being here with us. Have a great day, everyone.